Hey guys, so I haven't posted for a couple of days and I wanted to share what I'm going to be doing this December. So it's December 2020, my rapid rating is been just under 1400 and I've come up with a strategy. I want to get up to 1500 for next year. My goal for 2020 was to get over 1400 and to stay over 1400 for the majority of the year, which I've done. And now I want to move it up to the next level. So my plan is, instead of trying to play lots of games of chess, the strategy is to play one rapid game per day, 30-minute rapid or whatever, and to give it 100% concentration. So it's all the same stuff that we talk about in Chess Bootcamp, just really focused on winning that one daily game. So here's today's game, and I picked it out of open challenges because I'm currently very kind of low with cold symptoms, so my energy's not 100% and my brain isn't working 100%, not firing on all cylinders. So I thought we'll pick a game that's going to be worth like 4 points if I win, but really make sure of it. So it's an interesting game, and it's one that really shows the power of the absolute pins. So let me take you through it. So I'm playing with the black pieces. My opponent starts with e4 and I reply with the French e6. d4 follows, which is very natural and normal. He's occupying the center. And I reply with d5, which is the normal continuation of the French. Now, white decides to capture on d5, and I recapture with my e-pawn. So we have the French exchange variation on the board, which has a reputation of being boring, but I don't think this game turns out boring at all. You don't want to capture with the queen, because that will just invite white to play, for example, knight to c3, kicking the queen away and getting free development. So pawn takes, and the next move is knight to f3. I reply with knight to f6. So we have a symmetrical position on the board. We're both defending our central pawns with knights. And white plays bishop to d3, preparing to castle. And that's fine. So I decide to bring out my light square bishop also and pin the knight on f3. White now plays the kick with h3. And I have a choice now. I guess one option is to capture the knight, but that would bring the queen into the game. That's okay. In the end, I decide against the retreat to h5 because I didn't really fancy the second kicker coming in, forcing my bishop back to g6, and then after g6 we could have an exchange of bishops, which isn't a bad position, but I would have double pawns and yet I'd have a semi-open h-file, so maybe it's not the end of the world. But in the end I decide just to play my bishop back to e6, adding a second or a third defender to this pawn here on d5. So far so good. But notice also that white now has a slightly weakened kingside, because white now goes ahead and castles kingside, which is good for me. But having pushed this h3 pawn does leave that pawn as a target, and this bishop could have ideas of coming in and capturing that pawn, thereby exposing white's king. So let's see how it goes. So I bring out my other bishop. So I've got ideas also of things like playing c6, dropping my bishop back, put my queen up onto d6 in line with the bishop there, and then maybe if I can clear this knight out of the way, dropping in with a surprise checkmate. So I'm really thinking about just lining my bishops up against the king side now that white's castled. And white now brings out his dark squared bishop to pin my knight. So I have a think about this. Now, and I decide that if white exchanges there on f6, that's not necessarily a bad thing for me, because it means that I've got a semi-open file on the g file. I can move my rook across, line it up with white's king, and that doesn't seem too bad. So I decide to bring out my other knight, preparing to castle maybe queenside, and also adding another defender to that knight there. White now comes in with an attack. Now, very importantly here, I cannot capture the knight with my dark squared bishop, because that would lead to the sequence of D captures, and then I've got this situation where I've got a knight that's pinned to my queen, and the knight itself is under attack by a pawn there. So I am very careful to avoid that particular exchange, and instead I go for the bishop kick myself. I want to see what White's idea is. What is your plan? What's your intention? White captures my knight, which is absolutely fine for me. Now I've got potentially 4 pieces, but really 3 pieces that can recapture. I can recapture with my queen, or my king, or my bishop. I could recapture with a knight, but that would drop the queen, so that's not really viable. So I decide to capture with a queen, and that comes with the advantage of opening up my ability to castle queenside. White now chooses to go ahead with the exchange, and I recapture, of course, with the g-pawn. So now I have this nice semi-open file looking up there at White's king. White now plays a quiet move, a3, and I indeed swing my rook across to g8. And now there's a very, very real threat, which is bishop takes h3. Okay, now this pawn right now on g2 is absolutely pinned. There's 2 types of pins, relative pin and an absolute pin. An absolute pin means that this piece cannot move legally. Right? If I capture with the bishop on h3, the pawn cannot recapture because it would put the king in check, and that would be illegal. So that's an absolute pin. A relative pin means that the piece cannot really move without exposing, potentially losing another higher value piece. But this is an absolute pin, which means that it can't legally move. So White spots this and decides to pin my bishop himself. So he moves his rook across from f1 to e1. So now this bishop itself is also in an absolute pin. So I can't proceed yet with my plan to capture on h3. So what do? I simply castle and break the pin. It would be foolish for White to capture on there, because he'd be exchanging a rook for a bishop and I get to undouble my pawns. So he doesn't do that. Here's what he does, and we are now only 3 moves from the end of the game. Because White decides to swing his rook up to e3 to protect this pawn. However, this is a serious miscalculation, because I have 2 pieces attacking the pawn. So it looks like, there's 2 defenders and 2 attackers, right? But there aren't, because when a piece is in an absolute pin, it is not a defender. It cannot recapture. It can't be part of that exchange. So I figure this out and I go for it. So I capture with the bishop on h3. White now thinks for 40 seconds and then blunders again, taking the bishop with the rook. I mean, it's already a very dangerous position. I've got options of bishop takes there, and if the king doesn't move, I can move like my bishop to f3 and win the queen, because bishop to f3 would come with a check from the rook. So that's one horrible outcome. Another possibility is to capture with the rook itself on g2 with check, and then if the king were to move to f1, then again I have ideas of discovered checks as well. So it's not a nice situation, but White goes ahead and captures with the rook, and what that allows me to do is capture the rook with the queen. This pawn cannot capture, it's still in an absolute pin. Okay, now White thinks a little bit more and then blunders again by trying to attack my queen now with his queen, moving it to f3. But again, the queen is undefended. This pawn cannot be a defender, because pawns can only capture on diagonals, and this pawn cannot move on a diagonal. It could legally move forwards. That's absolutely fine, because it doesn't leave the king in check. But this pawn cannot capture on either of its potential squares. So queen takes queen. I've got a massive material advantage now. I've got a bishop looking down h2. I've got the queen that could come into d1, which would force the bishop to come in. It's an absolutely horrible position. And obviously, there's an immediate threat of queen takes g2 checkmate. So at that point, White actually ran his clock all the way down from 11 minutes because he couldn't think of anything to do. So I think that just really shows the power of the pin when you get to use it properly. And also, I think something else that I'm quite proud of in this game is the way that I did take my time and I thought through my opening moves pretty carefully. I didn't want to give White, for example, free development or free moves or the initiative or tempo or anything like that. So I'm really learning, I think, right now that these first moves of the game in the opening are actually very significant and really do lay the groundwork for the way that the game is going to develop. So, thinking about these moves, spending 20 seconds or more on these moves and thinking, okay, well, if I retreat, for example, the bishop to h5, what is likely to happen? And is that a scenario that I want to see? Is that a picture of the board that I'm happy to see? And in this instance, I decided to move back, castles, develop, attack, and then think carefully about the attack. I'm not too worried about that attack. Knight comes in, I'm not too worried about that. Okay, kick, capture, 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 and then a slow move by my opponent, lay the groundwork for my attack, and you see already here I've got a killer attack lined up with the pin already in place. And White is looking very much behind in development at this point. Tries to prevent the attack, but all of White's moves now are just losing. Because this rook move is not a defense. And he should have thought about that. And that capture is not a defense, because the pawn is pinned. And that bringing that queen out is no good either, because the pawn is pinned. So there you go. Pins can be very, very powerful. I'll see you next time.